Hi, this is Dada Groover with The Inspired Writer, and I don't finish all the books I start. If a book bores me, I just let it go and put that damn thing down. How often do you do that? Or are you the kind of person that just slogs through it and learns something from it and enjoys it even if it's boring? Whichever type of person you are, today I'm going to talk about what makes a book boring and how to not make those mistakes that make that book boring. Don't forget to click subscribe and ring that little bell so you'll get notifications of all the videos that come out on The Inspired Writer. There are a lot of things that can make a book boring, and there's one group of things I want to say that really stand out, that I don't want to say they necessarily put the reader to sleep, but sometimes they really do. With a lot of the writers that I train, I see a lot of resistance to this, and this is what I'm going to talk about. Are you intrigued? Let's hope so. That is conflict. And I want to talk about conflict and the way that conflict is presented in such a manner that it is intriguing to the reader. So first of all, you need to get over this, or you might have already gotten over it, but people are intrigued by conflict. They are interested by conflict. When there's conflict going on, they want to know what's happening. I'll never forget this time, my wife and I, Rachel Jane, were walking through a big box store, and on one of the aisles far, far away, there was this couple having a fight, having a verbal fight. And one thing I noticed was that everyone else in the store was silent. Everyone else was kind of listening with one ear to what was going on with the couple, because conflicts interest us. And when there isn't conflict, it is boring in literature, in movies. Now, movies can go the other way. Sometimes movies have too much conflict because screenwriters are taught you have to have a lot of conflict. They get this point, but writers of novels, memoir, how-to nonfiction, a lot of times they don't think they need conflict. For example, especially with nonfiction writers. Because, it's nonfiction. People are reading it to get something. Yes, they are. But to make nonfiction very engaging, say, for example, it's how-to nonfiction. You're basically showing people how to do something. Then when they see conflict, when they see a story there, when they see something that's happening and there's this conflict, that becomes much more interesting for them. In fiction, it is absolutely essential. And the second part of this package that I want to talk about is sometimes the reluctance of people to humanize that conflict. So when I say humanize, you can have an opponent, or call it an antagonist, that is not human. For example, it could be a monster, it could be an animal, it could be the weather, a harsh environment, whatever it is. There's many different ways that the antagonist or opponent can be manifest. And a lot of times my students will ask me, well, can I just have it my inner conflict? And I said, yes, of course you can. And if that's all you have, you're going to bore people to death. You really are. So humanizing that conflict, in other words, having an opponent in your story. And again, when I say story, I'm also referring to memoirs, things that really happened. And I do have the belief that everybody has opposition in their lives. We all have had opposition. It's part of life. It's part of how life goes on. And if you want to put blinders to that, it's up to you. That's fine with me if you do. But if you're writing a memoir and you're taking out all the opposition, all the people that got in your way, kept you from getting what you wanted, or they wanted the same thing in competition with you, but you didn't want to write about it, it's up to you. It's up to you. You don't have to write about it, and you don't have to make your book interesting. But I believe that you absolutely do have to have that opposition to make your book interesting, whichever kind it is. So humanizing. If you humanize that conflict, in other words, you have a person who is in the way of your goals. And by the way, when we say antagonist or opponent or opposition, a lot of times people think, well, it has to be like a snidely whiplash. Remember that from the cartoons back in the old days? Oh my goodness. I don't want to even say how old that was for me. But there was a snidely whiplash who was the evil, sinister person. He was always up to no good. And a lot of times we think, well, I don't have anybody like that in my life. You may not. There may not be anybody like that in your fiction novel. There may not be any room for that in your how-to nonfiction book. That's a definite, distinct possibility. However, the opponent can be someone that winds up being on your side at the end. Romance novels are very typical of this. I am not a romance writer. I never plan to be. You never know, but I'm not planning to be. But romance novels, the two characters, which is usually a man and a woman, they have, and of course, there's gay romance is a big genre, a big subgenre now, but there's typically there's a man and a woman, and they are in opposition, they are in conflict, and that makes it interesting. That makes people want to read, well, how are they going to resolve this? Now, if you're reading a romance book and you're a romance reader, you know it's going to have a happy ending. They're going to get together. It's kind of, sorry to spoil the whole romance novel world for you, but this is kind of how they all do turn out. And, but how the conflict is resolved is part of the whole interest. How is it their true feelings for each other will come to the surface? And yes, it can be kind of a cliche unless it's done really expertly. And I have seen those books in that genre, in that romance genre, that are done really expertly. So they definitely can be done in such a way that it's engaging and whatever. Any genre can be written very, very well, and there are different rules for different genres. I'm just using romance writing as an example. All right, so the conflict is there, and then how that conflict is resolved and how it goes up, and sometimes it's worse, and then it might get a little better, and then it's much worse. However, it can be done in such a way to make it interesting, and the conflict itself is always interesting. And again, it can be opposition. So in my current book I'm writing, The Reluctant Visionary, there is two main characters at different time periods, and it's an alternating timeline. It's the grandmother in 1960s Tennessee and the granddaughter in present-day Texas. And they both have different levels of opposition. And some of those opponents, they're bad people. They're just like, there's no other way to say it. They are bad people. And some of them, they're not bad people at all, but they're just in opposition to the main character. For example, in one of the timelines, the main character's brother is also her opponent. And ultimately, they love each other. Ultimately, they have a close relationship, but he's still her opponent, and he gets in the way of what she wants to do. So this is very important. So the opponent is what gets in the way, and the conflict happens when the opponent wants one thing and the protagonist wants the same thing or something similar, and they're both not going to get it. So that's what makes it engaging. And to think that, I don't need to do this, I don't need to have this opposition, my humble opinion is that it's always going to be a mistake. You will always have a less interesting book as a result. So I mentioned how-to nonfiction. So say you're writing a book on, what is it? You're writing a book on accounting. And say it's a book on holistic accounting. If I was writing a book on accounting, it would be holistic accounting, like all the different things that would make you an awesome accountant and make you very attractive to clients and make you actually even love your work. So let's just say you're writing a book on those things. If you have your own stories in there, in that book, it's going to make it so much more interesting. They're going to want to know who you are. Whoever's reading that book is going to want to know who you are as a writer, yes, but mainly as a person, as a human being. And they're going to know how you do accounting and what really draws you to that, what's engaged you in it. And they are going to want to know what got in your way of getting to where you are right now. Same thing with memoir. Same thing with memoir. And I have coached, I can't tell you how many people I've coached, and they say, yeah, in my memoir, I don't really have a conflict there. And I ask them questions. I can ask them questions for 5 minutes, and then they're like, well, there is that. Yeah, and there's also that. Yeah, oh, and they'll come up with more conflict than they even need. And I've seen that many times where people think they don't have conflict. So my humble suggestion is look for that conflict. Look for the conflict in your fiction. Look for the conflict in your memoir. Look for that conflict in your how-to nonfiction. It is there. And if you can show people that conflict, they will find it very interesting. Now, as I mentioned before, my book, The Reluctant Visionary. So the main character, she has conflict with her brother. She also has conflict with the neighbor across the street, who is very antagonistic. She runs an organic farm along with her brother and stepfather, and he runs a cattle ranch, and he is very much at odds with the whole family across the street. So he's not an evil person, but he is an angry person. He is a different kind of antagonist, where he's in her face, and you get it. The reader knows that. And then there's another level of antagonist, which I'm not going to tell you about just because I don't want to give too much away, but they're really, really bad people, like extremely bad people, but almost about as bad as you can get. So I believe having the different levels of conflict, the different levels of antagonists or opponents, it's all very interesting. Same thing, again, talking about my book. In the 1960s timeline, the main character there, one of the opponents, is her father. Her brother is an ally. He's not an opponent at all. He completely helps her. Her father, however, is an opponent. And there's even a bigger opponent, a more... it is an actual evil person, yeah, who's in that book. And not that you have to have that. You don't have to have an evil person, but you need to have some level of conflict. And if you have different layers of conflict, where some of them resolve, some of them don't resolve, I believe, well, let me clarify that. When I say some of them don't resolve, they don't resolve positively. Usually with conflict, it's good to have them resolved. You don't have to do that, but I like to have conflicts resolved by the end of the book. And some of them are resolved because the protagonist wins. Some of them resolve because they were at cross purposes, and then they compromised, and then they're going the same direction, or they come to a different understanding. There's many, many ways. There's millions of ways you can resolve conflicts. And if you have different conflicts that resolve in different ways, that is going to make your book very interesting. So those are my 2 big tips for today. Don't shy away from conflict. Think of how you can add, and by one little tip around that is start with something that's more extreme. And this is for all kinds of writing, for doing dialogue, for doing scenarios, environments, whatever you're doing, make it more extreme and then tone it down. I find that it's easy to do that way, rather than try to get it perfect that first time through. So go a little bit extreme. Like, look at your work and say, okay, how can I add some kind of extreme conflict? What can I do that's a little bit over the top in terms of conflict? And then tone it down from there. Or not. You may not want to tone it down. I hope that was helpful for you, and I really honestly hope that it helps you improve your writing. I'm here for you. This is Dada Groover, and please don't forget to click that subscribe button, ring that little bell, and if you like the video, click like.